Hi, it's Paul Guppy with the Washington Policy Center. Here's our latest legislative update on what's going on in Olympia that, of course, affects the lives of all of us across Washington state. So we are now in the 13th day of the legislative session out of a 60-day session that's planned. The first cutoff date that's planned by the legislature is coming up on February 4th. That is the cutoff date for policy committees. So in theory, if a bill has not passed a committee by then in either the House or the Senate, it is dead for the session. Of course, I always throw in the caveat that no bill is really dead because leadership can bring it back anytime they like. Budget bills, appropriations bills, spending bills are on a slightly different track. They have more time to pass committee. In this update, what I'm going to cover is a bill that proposes that lawmakers live under the same rules that apply to the rest of us, always a good idea. A bill about microchipping workers, employees in the workplace. The I-5 bridge replacement project over the Columbia. There are some new cost estimates on that. A new payroll tax that's being proposed in Olympia. A threat to federal funding that's looming on the horizon. And then lastly, I'll touch on legislation that would require farm workers to join a unionization of agriculture. So I'll get to that in a second. First up, though, is a proposal that from Representative Jim Walsh, a Republican. His bill is HB 2591. This essentially says, hey, lawmakers should live under the same rules as everybody else. Specifically, his bill is a response to a bill introduced by Senator Valdez, Democrat. Her bill, SB 5973, I've mentioned it before, but her bill would require that no initiative could be covered, could be considered or receive a ballot title from the Secretary of State until it has shown at least 1,000 people have signed up to support the initiative. In other words, if a citizen wants to propose an initiative or a group and wants to propose reform that would apply to the legislature or change state law, they would first, before they could do anything else, get 1,000 signatures. So what Representative Walsh proposes is, okay, then why doesn't the same rule apply to lawmakers? His bill would say that no lawmaker could introduce a bill until they had 1,000 signatures. I love this idea. So it's like what's good for the goose is good for the gander. And this is a great way to wake up lawmakers who want to impose restrictions on the initiative process. One thing that always drives me crazy about the way these bills are introduced, Senator Valdez's bill, I mean, is that she says that the bill is about, quote, protecting the integrity of the initiative process, when it actually does the opposite. It makes it harder for citizens to introduce initiatives. Of course, the partisan lens is that Democrats find the initiative process to be highly annoying. They continually push unpopular ideas like violating parental rights or girls playing in boys' sports in school. And popular initiatives come up, or initiatives against the income tax, for example, which pass regularly in our state. So in order to prevent these annoying voters out there, the people, from using the initiative process, Senator Valdez wants to create this 1,000 signature barrier. Well, Representative Walsh says, okay, that's fine. Let's just have the same rule for lawmakers before they can impose a bill. The housekeeping part of this that might be useful is that lawmakers regularly introduce somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 bills every session. So it might cut down on the volume of ideas that they are proposing. Of course, this also goes to the core principle that Washington Policy Center is always talking about, and that is protecting our popular democracy in Washington state, access to the ballot for citizens' initiatives. It also goes against the kind of arrogant attitude that you often get with lawmakers, and that is, hey, I'm imposing rules for thee, but not for me, okay? Having exceptions to rules that lawmakers don't live by the same standards as everyone else. And Representative Walsh is basically trying to send that signal. Next issue is an issue that I call, hey, boss, don't microchip me. So there have been proposals that employers, this starts in other states, are asking, it always starts out voluntary, for employees to have a microchip under their skin, like in their hand, let's say, so that you just wave it in front of a reader, and it's used for security or getting into a building or accessing certain areas. It's supposed to be really convenient. But of course, this idea horrifies a lot of people. So a bill has been introduced by Representative Breanne Thomas she represents Seattle and Vashon. She's a Democrat. Her bill is HB 2303, and it would, very simple, prohibit any employer from requesting, requiring, or coercing employees to have a microchip implanted under their skin. This is an obvious idea, if you ask me. The problem with these proposals, and again, this has started in some other states, is it starts out voluntary, and then before you know it, the boss is saying, no, it's mandatory. The other part of coercion is they'll say something, the company, let's say, sometimes the government does this. Hey, we're not forcing you to do anything. We're just going to make your life really, really difficult until you comply. So these mandates, whether it's in the private sector or the public sector, are always suspicious when they start out supposedly voluntary. Usually there's some kind of suggested coercion behind it. So Representative Thomas is getting ahead of this problem. We commend her for it. And this should be a very popular bipartisan idea. It is certainly something that Washington Policy Center would support. And we'll see how that bill does. It also brings up this apocalyptic future of science fiction that you hear about, where people are being turned into robots, or advance and be mechanized. The more digital technology we have, the better. It's the first step to a brave new world. I know that this all sounds kind of over the top, but we have seen that ideas start out small and then they tend to grow. It reminded me from a policy point of view of the original thinking of the Social Security number that was enacted first in the 1930s. It only applied to people who were in the workforce, number one. And number two, the government only assigned you a Social Security number when you got your first job. So when you entered the workforce, you got a number. Well, here we are today in the modern world, and Social Security numbers are now issued mandatorily to every baby that's born in the United States. So it went from being a number for workers and for a social insurance program like Social Security to now it's our national identification number that applies to everybody. So I'm just explaining that that's the way these things grow, and we need to watch out. I'm not necessarily saying that Social Security numbers are bad. It's just that they start out small and then gradually expand, and by the way, become a mandate for everyone. So it's something to watch out for. Another thing to watch out for is cost increases on massive public works projects. This is it's almost like a tradition in the United States. And yes, it's happening in Washington state as well. So for decades, there's been talk about replacing the I-5 bridge, Interstate 5 bridge that goes from Clark County into Oregon over the Columbia River. The first bridge was opened in 1917. A second bridge was added in the 1950s. And now it's time to upgrade and replace this major transportation corridor in the Northwest. That makes perfect sense. Representative Lay, a Republican who represents that area, has been keeping an eye on the costs. He published a piece recently pointing out, trying to inform the public, that costs for the bridge replacement are skyrocketing. He has really pressed the planning staff to give solid numbers about how much this bridge would cost, and the cost keeps going up. So here's an example. The cost estimate started out in 2020. There was a cost estimate that it would be $4.8 billion to build a new bridge across the Columbia. Okay, a couple of years later, 2022, that cost estimate had risen to $7.5 billion. Today, it's as high as $17.7 billion. And having light rail on the project would account for about $2 billion of that cost. So just adding light rail to the bridge automatically costs $2 billion. Proponents of light rail think that that's a wonderful thing. They think it should be required. They also say that it would be, I love this phrase, high capacity light rail going across the bridge, expanding Portland's existing light rail system. You always got to watch out for the language. Sure, the light rail trains have the capacity to carry a lot of passengers, but do they actually have passengers? And Portland's light rail has been in trouble for years. Over 10 years, they have experienced $6 billion in losses. So I would not call that high capacity rail. The example that I use is I say, at home, excuse me, at home, I have a suitcase with a capacity to hold $1 million. Does it actually have $1 million in it? No, but it has that capacity. So I always apply that kind of skepticism whenever I hear proponents pushing light rail and how great it's going to be. Regarding the larger project, it's obvious that interest groups are jumping on the bandwagon here. They see that this is a huge public works projects, and I think they all want their piece. I think of this as being like the incentive is get on board before the gravy train leaves the station. I think that is what is driving the cost. And there are all kinds of groups, construction companies, unions, other interest groups definitely want a piece of this action. We have already seen this before many times in the United States. One example is the infamous Boston Big Dig, another highway tunnel that originally was going to cost $2.8 billion, and the true cost ended up being $14.6 billion. It also added years and years to the time that they were going to finish it. Another example is, again, infamously, the California High-Speed Rail project, which is the train to nowhere, and yet it is costing billions and billions of dollars. The thing about the I-5 project is it is necessary. It is an essential link in our transportation system. What I think of is, the Columbia River isn't any wider than it was in 1917. Why is it costing us 10, 50 times more to build a modern bridge, not counting inflation, but it just seems to take forever and cost billions and billions of dollars above the estimate. The last element I'll mention regarding transportation is Representative Fye is still continuing to push. He's the Democrat chairman of the Transportation Committee in the House. He is continuing to push, slowly behind the scenes for a mileage tax. The name of it keeps changing: vehicle miles traveled, road usage charge. My favorite name for this tax is distance-based user fee. So in public policy analysis, one indicator that an idea does not have popular support is that the name of it keeps changing. So as the sponsors discover that they are pushing an idea that is highly unpopular, they change the label in hopes that people don't notice. So the vehicle miles traveled, the mileage tax is still out there, and we can expect that idea to be debated. They might not push it hard in this session because we have an election coming up this year, but I think next year that will be a major push in Olympia. We can watch for that. Next issue is a new payroll tax that is being considered in Olympia. Ryan Frost, who is our top-notch budget analyst, testified on Thursday before the House Finance Committee on a bill, HB 2100. And the name of this tax is called the payroll expense tax. Again, labels as to whether does that tell you what's really going on here? But it's an entirely new payroll tax that would apply across statewide above a certain income level. In other words, they measure how much a company's payroll is, and then they have to pay a tax above that, or a certain number of employees who are, quote, high earners. This mechanism has already been in place in Seattle for a number of years. That is what the thrust of Ryan's analysis was. He was like, we don't have to guess. We can already see a real world implementation of this idea in Seattle, and it has failed in the sense of creating a more hostile business climate in Seattle. Sarah Nelson, who was on the city council, she pointed out at the time that the so-called jumpstart tax, as it was called by its proponents in Seattle, has not jump-started the recovery of the economy after COVID. And in fact, hundreds of businesses have left downtown Seattle. You can just walk the street and see this yourself, that conditions in Seattle have really degraded, both quality of life on the streets, but also the business climate, high taxes. Downtown Seattle also has a, quote, special improvement district where businesses there pay an added tax, supposedly to improve conditions on the street. That has been only partially successful at best. So all these taxes add up. What Ryan points out is that these kind of jumpstart tax just sparks job creation, sure, in other places like Bellevue and Redmond outside of Seattle. Amazon has moved workers, Microsoft has moved workers, and those are only the big companies. So that tells you that underneath that, there are hundreds, if not thousands, of small entrepreneurs who are making decisions to move out of a high tax jurisdiction like Seattle and move to the suburbs. Okay, fine. If this bill, HB 2100, passes, then the payroll expense tax would apply to all businesses in Washington state. Socialists always think that they can get around the problem of people leaving, voting with their feet, by just expanding the jurisdiction that is covered by socialism. So going from Seattle to Washington State as a whole, or even an entire country in the case of historical examples, socialists always think they can get around people getting away. That's not going to work. Seattle is already losing businesses kind of slowly under the radar again. It's very difficult to measure because businesses do not announce we're leaving the state because the taxes are too high. And that makes sense. Why? Business owners don't want to anger Democrats or politicians. They don't want to get involved in politics at all. But they will certainly move to another state where taxes are lower. The gaining states are places like Texas, Florida, Utah, Tennessee. They are gaining population, they're gaining businesses, and Washington State, as I've said a number of times before, is losing kind of low-key way. And I'm just waiting for the latest census numbers to come in and show that Washington may be losing population as well. We'll see how that comes out. The other example of expanding socialism is I think that people who promote these ideas, they believe that misery loves company. Hey, if everybody in Seattle has to pay this tax, let's just make everybody pay it, and then we're all in the same boat together. There's also something about human nature that if people feel that something is inevitable and you can't do anything about it, they just stop talking about it, which of course for the high tax people is perfectly fine. That means that the population has accepted paying the tax. The Democrats, the government gets the money, and the rest of us kind of suffer in silence until, as I say, people decide to move someplace else. Moving on to the next issue is something on the horizon which I think could threaten some of the federal funding that we receive in our state. And again, I'm looking at examples that have happened in other states. So the Office of Management and Budget in Washington, D.C. has announced that because of corruption that has occurred in social programs in other places, they are initiating an anti-corruption review of 13 blue states that are sanctuary states. To see where every federal dollar goes and whether it's being spent properly. So this is an audit, a review of how money is being spent. Washington is one of those states. Our legislature passed a sanctuary law in our state in 2019. It's RCW 43-17-425. And that basically just tells local law enforcement to not cooperate with federal law enforcement when it comes to enforcing immigration laws. And of course, we see this debate happening across the country. Where that could come back to bite us is this review about funding. So what the federal government is doing is putting a scope on states that have declared to be sanctuary states to see whether federal money is being spent properly. The Department of Health and Human Services has already frozen $10 billion in funding in TANF funds, that's like welfare type funding, social services block grants, and other kind of social spending like that in New York, Colorado, Minnesota, California, and Illinois. So that's 5 states that have already experienced this funding freeze, and it could happen in Washington State as well. We're trying to get ahead of that and anticipate it. And of course, it couldn't come at a worse time for Olympia because they are worried to the skies that they have this deficit budget gap that I've talked about before. And the last thing that Washington needs is to lose federal funding right at the time when we're trying to balance our state budget. And the last issue I'll touch on here is a bill, SB 6045, that is being analyzed by Pam Lewison, who's the agriculture policy expert on our state. And what that bill would do would be basically require farm workers to join a union. Now, of course, that isn't technically what the bill says. It says that it's protecting worker rights, that it makes union membership optional. But again, experience has shown that once unionization and collective bargaining is allowed or required in a certain area, individual workers soon find that the daily reality that they live with, you got to join the union or you're going to lose your job. That's basically the way it boils down. When we debate this issue with people on the other side, they'll always say like, oh no, it's voluntary, nobody's being coerced. Well, in effect, as soon as a union, which is like its own kind of business, begins to expand market share, they start pressuring people to sign up. One indicator of that in this bill, and again, it's SB 6045, is that it does not provide for secret ballot or private ballot elections to join a union. They use something else called the card check system. And that's where union organizers can go around one by one, individually to workers, buttonhole them, pressure them into signing a card, and then boom, you're a member of the union, you're paying dues. Studies show that 90% of the campaign contributions in our state from unions go to one political party. So you can see that there's kind of a symbiotic relationship here that members of the legislature pass a bill, it expands collective bargaining, unions get involved, they sign up more workers, they take money out of the worker paycheck for dues, and a lot of those dues end up going to campaign contributions, which tend to benefit one political party over the other. So it operates as like a funding circle. We'll see how that bill goes. Again, Pam is watching it very closely. And with that, I will wrap up this update, and I'll be back in the future with another update. And thank you very much for listening.
If you found this informative, share it with a friend, and consider checking out one of our suggested videos over here. Make sure you're subscribed so that you can stay up to date with the latest policy news from Washington.